Professor, tell us about the second option. I think you bring a very interesting thing is actually what I like what you said earlier is that Europe, knowing that they're going to have to live next to Russia for the next 100 years or 1,000 years, is actually working closer with Russia, and and I'd like you to expand upon that. I mean, we know before the war, for example, most of the natural gas that was going into Germany, obviously going through Nord Stream pipeline, that was a very, very key element to Germany's manufacturing prowess. I'd like you
Mm,
to expand upon the second point. Is it possible
mm.
for Europe to actually move closer to Russia after this conflict and after what we've seen?
Definitely. See, in geopolitics, you must always put all options on the table, including, as I emphasize, the unthinkable options. And people forget. I mean, this is why I wish the Europeans would study Southeast Asia for a bit longer. When the ASEAN was set up in 1967 in the Cold War as a pro-American organization, its creation was denounced by both Moscow and Beijing in 1967.
Hmm.
And you know what? So one would assume that, okay, because of that, ASEAN will forever be caught in an antagonistic relationship with its neighbor China.
Right.
But the ASEAN countries are extremely pragmatic. They said, hey, we have to live with China for the next 1,000 years. And we got to make sure that we find ways or means of getting along in such a way that on issues that are important to us, we stand up with China. And yet on other issues that are important to China, we find ways and means of getting along with China. So, this is what pragmatism is all about. You adapt and adjust, and you negotiate a fair compromise, and then you have a good relationship for the long term.
Right.
And I'm astonished that the Europeans didn't make any such effort at all to understand Russian concerns and to work towards building up the trust of the Russians with Europe. And this is an obvious thing that the Europeans should have been doing, because right now the United States is clearly the number one power in the world, no question whatsoever. One of the biggest lessons of history is that no one power remains the number one power forever. And 100 years from now, United States may not be the number one power, may not be the number two power, maybe the number three, number four power. If geopolitics is going to change, you must always keep your options open. But one
Right.
thing that doesn't change are your neighbors. Your
Right.
neighbors never go away. And a strong country like Russia, a resilient country like Russia, is not going to disappear anytime soon. So at the end of the day, the Europeans have to live with Russia over the next 1,000 years, and live with Russia even when the United States is no longer the great power. So why not work out your own autonomous arrangements with Russia, instead of saying, oh, when it comes to Russia, we'll just loyally follow whatever the United States does? And that's very unwise
Yeah.
of the Europeans. And I say this as a friend of the Europeans. I'm trying to say, hey, take care of your interests first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of these options are, fantastic and very, very insightful. I'd like to talk about the third one because this one specifically involves China, and I think you bring up a very interesting point here. We see a tremendous amount of migrants, moving away from Africa. Certainly going into Europe. And why? Because they're searching for a better life. They're wanting more opportunity. As we know, Africa has a tremendous amount of potential, but has not been as developed as it probably should have been. But there's an opportunity now, potentially to move closer to China. And I think we saw very interesting, the German trade minister had said that, for example, if they get caught in a tariff war with Donald Trump and the United States, you could potentially see Germany combating that by actually shifting closer to China. So I'd like you to talk about option three, in the sense that Europe can actually move
Yeah.
closer to China and what that
Yeah.
would mean.
Well, I think, in one of the key points I emphasized about geopolitics is that you got to be very cold and calculating in trying to assess where your next big threat is going to come from.
Mm.
And in the case of Europe, the next big threat is not going to come from Russian tanks at all. It's going to come from the demographic explosion in Africa. I think here's one statistic that every European should know. In the year 1950, Europe's population was twice the size of Africa. Now, Africa's population is more than 2.5 times more than Europe. By 2100, Africa's population will probably be 10 times the population of the combined population of the European Union, 10 times.
Wow.
So if you have a lot of Africans, and unless you promote the growth and development of Africa, there'll be more and more Africans trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. So how do you prevent a major migration from Africa to Europe? I mean, assuming that you're not going to start killing people at your borders. So the only way to do that is to support the economic development of Africa and support any country which invests in Africa. Because every piece of investment in Africa is a gift to Africa and a gift to Europe at the same time. So if the Europeans were smart, they should welcome Chinese investment in Africa. But what I find quite shocking is that leaders like Elizabeth von der Leyen and Annalena Baerbock are sacrificing European interests by criticizing Chinese investments in Africa.
Right.
This goes against European interests. Why are you doing that? Actually, China is doing European Union a favor by investing in Africa. And the European Union, in fact, should be working with China to promote more Chinese investment in Africa rather than trying to oppose it, because the United States opposes it.